Happy 420, happy Easter. Do you know, I'm curious, how many people here have heard me speak before? Okay, so a few. And you probably know, I'm a scientist, I've been studying psychedelics for quite a while, and I usually do the thing that scientists do, which is hide behind my science, put up some slides with charts on and brains, and do all that. And so I'm doing something a little daring for me this morning, which is to not have any slides at all. Very little preparation, if I'm honest. I have a few themes, I have about 10 words written on a piece of paper in terms of themes to cover. But I thought it would be an interesting experiment for me, and hopefully, for those who've heard me speak before, something a little different for you in terms of the style of this particular talk. One thing I will be sure to do is give plenty of time for questions. So if things go in such a way that it seems as though I'm not doing that, then interrupt me. Put your hands up and we'll go straight to Q&A and break it up that way. So, it's Easter Sunday, and I was brought up with religion in my life. I was brought up Catholic. I went to Catholic schools throughout my life until what we'd call secondary school in the UK, or high school. And it was a big part of my life, but when you're immersed in something like a fish in water, you don't realize that there's any water around you. And so that was my experience. I thought that it was a given, all these stories that I'd been taught at school, at church. Santa Claus, that one, that one went away at a certain age, but Jesus rising from the dead, and all these rich stories that I was taught, I did very much take as a given. And I went to a primary school and a middle school with a head mistress who was a nun. It was pretty full on. I was an altar server, used to carry the cross on Easter Sunday. So, I was very much a fish in that water, religion all around me. And as I entered my teens, stopped going to church, things, changed in an interesting way, in an emotional way, in a psychological way. Obviously, people are changing as they mature anyway. I was curious, I was probably somewhat, emotionally unstable into my teens, as many teens are. Unfortunately, it's the way it goes. And I was drawn to substances, and I was especially drawn to psychedelics. And I'd heard a lot about LSD. It was coming up a lot. I was into underground dance music. I had a bedroom that was sort of floor to ceiling covered in rave flyers, 90s rave flyers. This is sort of like early to mid 1990s. But there was something about LSD, about psychedelics, that especially drew me. And so I had my first experience in my teens. I was pretty young, 14. I wasn't even 15. It was that summer. Summer of 95, I guess. And it blew me away. It changed. I think it changed my life. It certainly changed me, as it does for so many people, the experience being so transformative. It's a curious thing, the experience under a psychedelic, that it recapitulates. The experience, the quality of the experience resonates with some of the themes that you'll find in religion, Christianity perhaps in particular. I don't know, having been such a successful world religion, it's curious, and of course others have thought about this, why is it done so well, in a sense? Different components there, I guess the promise of, in a sense, power at a time in history where power was concentrated more, you could argue, on single individuals, in kingdoms on earth, and a strong degree of sort of, violent control from the top. And so a lack of freedom, and then with this idea of finding power and freedom in the kingdom of heaven. What a promise that things could be so bad here, in the mundane, whether, persecuted or just generally living a hard life. And yet this promise of this, resplendent place that one can go to after death. You can imagine the pull, the allure there. So that's one theme. But there's another that I think perhaps, if there was one theme, perhaps the first word I put down on my little piece of paper that I wanted to have as a through thread for this talk, it's rebirth. And I guess that's there with, you die, it's Easter Sunday, Jesus, he rises again and goes on. You die, you go to this heavenly place, and so the theme is there. Baptism again, so the process, the practice and culture of reconciliation, of absolving sin and going again with a fresh slate, so that rebirth within a lifetime to go again, different now, refreshed, like a baby born again. It's there in, so strong, and probably a defining aspect of the success of Christianity, perhaps somewhat Christianity-centric there, but in terms of religions that, promise in a sense that second chance, it's certainly a strong theme in Catholicism, and it comes up so powerfully in the context of psychedelics. If we think of, for example, the first ever LSD trip that happened however many years ago yesterday, at least the planned big trip, in a sense. He didn't know, Albert Hoffman, quite how big. I think it was 200 mics, was it 250? Anyway, pretty decent dose of LSD. The first ever intentional LSD trip, because a few days prior he'd had apparently a serendipitous encounter with LSD, somehow got into his body, ingested, and then he had that initial experience, April 16th. But in his beautiful, almost infamous reports of his experiences, and particularly the one that's now celebrated as Bicycle Day, if you read about the trip itself, it sounds pretty dark, pretty nightmarish. He thinks he's going insane, classic stuff. He thinks he's dying. He manages to get home, as we know, famously on his bike, and then he's resting out this nightmarish trip, still thinking he's dying. His neighbor comes round, takes this form of a malevolent witch, apparently. She offers him milk, and he thinks he's being poisoned. Such powerful archetypes. So the trip itself sounds like ideal drugs war propaganda in a sense. It's like, don't touch this substance, it's dark, it takes you to a dark place. However, when you read about how he felt the next day, he says almost, to the word, I think, I felt reborn, and that's the first ever intentional acid trip. And there, I think without any obvious cultural priming, he uses that terminology, I felt reborn. Said he had a really good night's sleep, woke up fresh, and I think there'd been a spring rain and everything was glistening, and breakfast tasted especially good. It's this fascinating reference to a kind of restoration, a kind of hinting at, I believe, a regeneration. I'll have to go to science because that's my role, that's what I do, that's why I'm on stage, so I will, but I'm trying to, in a sense, subtly join some dots for you with psychology and biology. We talk about rebirth in this very deep psychological way, being able to go again, like a fresh slate, perhaps some of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, what the things that life throws at you, whether it's trauma, complex trauma, adversity, broadly defined, it has its impact, but to have these big transformative experiences and then afterwards to say you feel reborn is really, getting to the core, getting to the not-so-secret source of why these compounds can be so interesting on an educational level, and as probably most of us know and appreciate, medicinal and helpful on a health and wellness level. So, yeah, that theme of rebirth is key, and if you consider where we are right now in history, however many decades on from the original bicycle day, and this era that we're living through, so often referred to as a Renaissance. To my knowledge, I don't think that term was being used, say, in the 50s or 60s. Some would say that was the first wave. I'm not so sure. At least a significant, cultural wave into mainstream Western society of psychedelic science and the clinical use of psychedelic therapies. But we know, of course, that the history is much, much deeper than that. So, where and when do you sort of call and label a renaissance? It's an open question, but yes, right now, for the last however many years, certainly since the turn of this millennium, we refer to this era of resurgent scientific and medical interest in psychedelics as a renaissance. And that term, I believe it's French, with Latin roots. I wonder if anyone knows what it translates to literally. No? Yes? Rebirth. It translates to rebirth. So there's an interesting sort of cycling of this theme that I really do believe is at the core of why psychedelic compounds are interesting and why they could be therapeutically useful. Like Stan Grof, who was also interested very much and wrote very beautifully about the theme of rebirth, I'm interested in the literal birth process, birth trauma, if you want, and the parallels there. But in bringing up Stan Grof, I really want to draw our minds to how psychedelic drugs are mere tools, inducers of the capacity for psychological rebirth that is in us intrinsically. We have that intrinsic potential for this profound transformation in our psychology. It's there. The power in the compounds is in a sense somewhat misleading because they're tools that are cracking open a system, but the power is intrinsic to the system itself, and that's of course why Stan and Christina Groff and others became interested in other ways to induce, in a sense, the same fundamental state. Different inducers, atypical breathing, breath work, holotropic breath work, however, in a sense, it's labeled or branded. The fundamental point to make is that there are different inducers. And the state, the capacity of the state is intrinsic to our psychology, to our biology, and we're not entirely in the dark about its nature. In a sense, that's been my main focus, inadvertently, ever since personally I turned on to psychedelics in my teens. For me, it began with what the hell was that? What the hell happened there? And that's true for so many of us, and we just take different routes in how we explore that question, in a sense. What the freaking heck was it's Sunday, Easter Sunday, careful with my language. Catholic, once a Catholic, always a Catholic. What was that? In a sense, what the hell was that? Then what, in a sense, path of understanding, path of knowledge, exploration, testing do you take? And I happened to take the academic one. It didn't happen straight away, but that's the route I went down, drawn to psychology, drawn to depth psychology, wanting to understand the nature of the unconscious mind, discovering Stan Groff and the idea that psychedelics open up the psyche. I understand psyche, which translates as soul, to mean the whole of the mind. Most literally, I wouldn't see a one-to-one between psyche and mind. I think mind, in a sense, doesn't do justice to psyche, and mind can be misunderstood as something, potentially somewhat quite shallow. But through psychedelics and through other exceptional experiences, we know that the mind certainly isn't shallow. It's incredibly, vastly deep. And therefore, psyche as soul or as the whole of the mind is how I like to think about our psychology. That's why I was drawn to depth psychology, because I wasn't seeing in other schools of psychology, like cognitive psychology, that there was a proper appreciation of the whole of the mind. That was what was drawing me in, yes, from my teenage psychedelic experiences. But I wasn't seeing answers. I wasn't getting the sustenance that I was yearning for from mainstream psychology, cognitive psychology, and so on. So that's why I went to the depth psychology, psychoanalysis, a view of the psyche that appreciates that it's incredibly deep, calls it, that depth, the unconscious mind, much of the mind being inaccessible, or at least difficult to accessible to conscious awareness. And so that school of psychology that appreciates that pulled me in, and that's where I found Stan Groff, and that's where I found the idea, now into my 20s, doing a master's in psychoanalysis in London, the idea that psychedelics open up the psyche, the whole of the mind. They make the unconscious visible to conscious awareness. And then that was very much a light bulb moment for me, and a little like in a sense, history repeating, or a full circle process, that changed my life too. So yes, turning on at 14, and then in a sense turning on intellectually, finding Stan Groff's work, studying psychoanalysis, and realizing that it didn't so much require a leap of faith, like a religion in a sense, to believe that this thing exists, the unconscious mind, but that there are tools, practical tools, psychedelic drugs being the prime example here, that can facilitate that understanding and awareness. So that was life-changing, and it was through that I then made concerted efforts to do this, in a sense, as a career path. I found opportunities in the UK to do a PhD doing human brain imaging research with psychedelics. I initially asked to do work with LSD, and circumstances were such that it was psilocybin that we first began to study. Now this is going into 2008, 2009, I'm completing my PhD, focused on something called the serotonin system, really important body chemical. I say it that way because most of it isn't in the brain, even though we tend to think of it as a brain chemical. It very much is, and it's critically important in the brain, but I think something like 90% is actually in the gut and gastrointestinal system. So in a sense, you could call it a gut molecule or hormone. But yeah, in the brain, it does some important things. I was studying its impact on sleep, and how MDMA use might impact on the serotonin system, and we could use sleep, which is sensitive to serotonin functioning, use sleep as an index of the health and functioning of people's serotonin systems, and whether that had been impacted or really damaged through MDMA use. And that was the kind of dominant cultural ethos, perspective at the time in terms of MDMA science and research. It was all on harms. That's changed somewhat now, but that was your way in a sense, and that was my way in. That was my PhD. But in cutting my teeth with basic neuropsychopharmacology, bit of a tongue twister, that was my way, and that was my opportunity to do what became the first, in a sense, basic, fundamental, functional magnetic resonance imaging study, fMRI study, of the impact of psychedelics on brain function. So we did that work around 2009, 10, published it in 2012. It was actually that work that created those two circles that have become pretty famous. Excuse me. I think there might be in maybe the front sort of hardcover of How to Change Your Mind. Very popular, being turned into street art and so on. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there's two circles that represent the quality of communication between regions in the brain. Ordinarily, say under a placebo, something inert that has no activity. What you see when you look in a brain under placebo is that systems in the brain are quite well circumscribed and boundaried. Regions within a system tend to communicate mostly to other regions within the same system. There's a kind of specialism, in a sense, to the quality of brain function, so that we can do certain functions, with a decent degree of finesse and precision, if you want, whether that's, processing things visually or our motor function, or our cognition being crisp and analytical and precise and enabling us to do, mathematical, algorithms and so on. But under psychedelics, that profile is radically changed. And I think it was the nature of the radical marked nature of the change that really captured people's imagination. You can talk and present for several hours on the science, saying a lot of words, you can write a lot, but to show those images, could say so many words in just the immediacy of the images. So a circle on one side, you see very little sort of crosstalk between regions on the periphery of the circle, and that's speaking to that principle of the communication going on mostly within systems, that cliquish kind of specialism, like other maths professors only talking to other math professors, never talking to the historians, that kind of thing, or the, anthropologists or whatever. Whereas under the psilocybin, it was a completely different picture. A lot of crosstalk going on between the different systems. This image was in color, so it was very colorful under the psilocybin. A lot of different colored lines crisscrossing this circle, as the visual system is talking more to the auditory system or the motor system or the high-level cognitive system. So, with science, with human brain imaging, which is what I do, most of what I do, we're in the dark. For me, a lot of the phenomenology, discovering Groff, and then just the rich literature from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there'd been so much said about the phenomenology, however abstract and as people love to say, ineffable, difficult to put into words, the experiences. The phenomenology, one could say, have been done pretty well. Done to death? I don't know. It'd been done pretty thoroughly. So, yes, the experience is of great, mystery in a sense. How is this possible? But, you dwell on that question, how is this possible? The greatest mystery, the greatest black box, in my view, and I felt this very early on, was the biology, was the nature of this nature. I never, even though I had a upbringing rich in supernaturalism, from a very tender age, schooled in magic. For those of you who know Catholicism and a Catholic Mass, there's so much magic. These days I look back on that with a kind of fondness in a sense. But, I compare it to my professional world today and style of thinking, and it's so different. But that supernaturalism is something that one sort of, it's a ready place to go, It's almost like the easiest step, you could say. When you have the experiences, you go to magic, It's no coincidence that the term magic mushrooms has been popularized like it has, because it feels magical. It feels transcendent in a way that leads you to think that this can't be of this mundane, world and existence. That's the easy step. I would say the more difficult step is to think, but what's really going on, in a sense? Like, what's going on the level of nature, of the biology? And that's the path. That's the path I took. And it's damn hard, it turns out, but it's been this dark black box that we're just beginning to shine a flashlight into, or feel our way around in, and find some things, some tangible things. That crisscrossing of communication, people sometimes wrongly think it was an anatomical hyperconnectivity. under the psilocybin. That's wrong. It's not that. That image doesn't say a growth of new neuronal connections. It doesn't say that. That would have to be an extrapolation or a guess beyond. It's saying that the communication, the activity, the ongoing, can get down to the source, its electrochemical communication is going on more freely across systems. There's a loss of constraint and an increase in freedom in the brain function, a loss of specialism, a loss of regularity in the activity. The activity is becoming dysregulated. And so through seeing that image, that little shape as you're feeling your way in the dark, you start thinking, oh, well, that's interesting. And when we found it alongside something else. So yes, the circles beautifully tell us about systems opening up, their boundaries breaking down, and systems that are usually somewhat separate, segregated, becoming, in a sense, desegregated under drugs. So that opening up was a beautiful principle that we first saw very clearly in that fMRI work that yielded those results and a lot more. But another principle that we discovered was the breakdown of regulation within systems. So yes, systems open up, but they also lose their intrinsic integrity. So, for example, there is a system in the brain that is very active, mostly all of the time, especially when we're awake, whether we're focusing on something or especially when we're not, when we're sort of daydreaming and imagining. This system, it's called the default mode network, is especially active all the time, as I said, most metabolically hungry system in the brain. Consumes a lot of the body's energy, the brain in general, but within the brain, this system consumes a lot of the brain's energy. And under psychedelics, its integrity breaks down. You could quite validly describe it as a disintegration of the system. We see it in this system, but we see it in a bunch of other systems. In this system, when we saw it, this system had already been spotlighted in human neuroscience as being a system associated with functions that someone, familiar with depth psychology or psychoanalysis might call ego functions, functions of the self, like self-regulation, having a sense of oneself in one's body, a sense of the self being different from others, sense of the self being independent from the external world to the self, and so on. So to see this system break down under psychedelics raised an interesting question in my mind. I wonder if it relates to this thing that people so commonly refer to in the context of psychedelic experiences of ego disintegration. We ran correlations between people's ratings of ego disintegration, briefing them what that abstract thing might be. Most of the people in our early studies were experienced with psychedelics, so they had some sense of that phenomenon, if you want. They'd rate its intensity, and we saw, yes, the bigger the disintegration in the default mode network, the bigger this experience of ego, ratings of ego disintegration. Over time, that's been somewhat well replicated. Perhaps we've dialed in on certain circuitry within that system. But this, I'd say, getting too much into the weeds, I want to zoom back out and just say two principles. Systems opening up, in a sense, even more generally, the brain's functioning, opening up, becoming more flexible, less segregated, somewhat less specialized, more generalized, but also showing properties of disintegration of systems and activity that is ordinarily in normal waking consciousness pretty tightly regulated, pretty ordered, pretty ordered. And so these two principles combined, plus some other stuff that I'll have to gloss over, said to me that maybe there's a common principle. Maybe there's just one principle that could describe these things and more, and maybe that principle is actually the thing that's at the core of what the psychedelic experience is. And I describe that thing borrowing from a very fundamental way of describing nature, everything, anything more or less in the universe, in terms of order and disorder. And I said, it seems so simple as to almost be too simple to be useful, but I do think it's useful, and I'll tell you why. That psychedelics increase disorder. They move the brain towards what I describe as a more entropic profile, and I call that the entropic brain. And the way I'd articulate it these days would be to say that psychedelics increase brain entropy, so they make brain activity less ordered. They break down regulation, so they're causing a dysregulation. They're making brain activity less predictable. It's unpredictable under drug. And that relates to the felt subjective experience, that this quality of brain activity is a readout on what it feels like to be in any conscious state. And that principle, I've got to say, is holding up remarkably well today. I first introduced it over 10 years ago now in 2014. I did a revision in 2018. I'm due another one, but I'm going to do a full job in a book that I'm writing called How Psychedelics Work. When will it be out? Well, it's written. It just needs a bit of editing. And it will be out, I'm going to guess, early next year. So soon, the thing's written, so it's coming. And so what does that mean? That there's a mapping between the degree of order or disorder in brain function in a conscious state. Psychedelics move the brain towards disorder, make brain activity more entropic. How does that relate to conscious experience? Consciousness is such a vague and abstract construct, phenomenon, thing. And so we've struggled really in science to make much headway in terms of describing its nature and its biology in particular. But to help us along, we can split it into two components that are pretty distinct. One of them is called phenomenal consciousness, but to put it in a more accessible way, you could say what it feels like to be in any state of consciousness, subjective experience, what it feels like. And it's that dimension that brain entropy reads out on, that it's a good map for. Might not be exactly the same thing because these things differ in aspect. One is a biological, physico-energetic phenomenon, brain activity, and the other one is a felt experience. So they're different in aspect, but there's a bridge between them. You can translate between them. So there's a difference in aspect, but these systems are entangled. And what this principle is telling us is that psychedelics, if they dial up brain entropy, they're dialing up the depth and range and diversity of felt conscious experience. There's more. In a sense, when there's more in brain activity, more independent bits, there's more in felt experience. There's more content. There's this really interesting question now, well, what if you ramp that up to 11, so to speak, What would that feel like? Would it be a DMT trip with bizarre, fractal geometry morphing into, a sense of some other sentient being or beings? really otherworldly, yet somehow strangely familiar? Would it be rich in that sense, contentful? Or would it be like a 5-MeO experience where people describe it as pure consciousness, in a sense a void, but also so full of content? It's an empirical question. But the other end of that dimension or spectrum is, in a sense, the easy end, because it had been known before we started doing our research with psychedelics and finding that increase in brain entropy. It'd been known for a few years that anesthetics, deep sleep, disorders of consciousness dial down brain entropy, and of course they dial down phenomenal consciousness. The lights go out, there's no content, you aren't aware of anything in a sense. So passing consciousness in that way, I think, is useful, and it's also it helps me be a bit more precise about what aspect of consciousness the entropic brain principle hypothesis is reading out on, and it's subjective experience, phenomenal consciousness. For another day, in fact, in the book, I talk about the other aspect that could be called access consciousness, the ability to be aware that you're aware. What's another term for it? Self-awareness. I like to call it ego consciousness. I think it's a faculty of our species that is somewhat unique to our species. That can be debated, but I think it's at least somewhat unique. And I think that's a somewhat different dimension. And sure, psychedelics impact on that too. It's not one and not the other, but that's perhaps a conversation and a debate for another day. Okay, I'm going to do a time check. And I want to, just before we go to questions, will we have about 15 minutes for questions? Is that right, timing-wise? Anyone? Thumb went up at the back. So if I was to stop now, we'd have 15 minutes. Let me do one more theme as briefly as I can, and it's quite an important one. So the entropic brain is a model of conscious experience, phenomenal consciousness. You could say it's a model of consciousness, but really it's a model of conscious states, what it's like to be in any conscious state. So I'd like to think it's a model that's useful for understanding consciousness, or a model that's useful in consciousness science. And that's arguably, one half of why psychedelics are interesting. Maybe it's the biggest half, I'm not sure. The other half is health. And there, the entropic brain effect is relevant. And here, the metaphor is one of a useful shake-up. The literal metaphor I used over 10 years ago now was of a snow globe. Those kind of toys or whatever that have some fake snow inside a glass globe and some water, typically, some liquid. You shake it up, and then it all goes, chaotic, and then it settles down. So I said the psychedelic experience is like that process of shaking, and that's the entropic brain effect. Now, think of psychopathology, that's a jargony word. Think of mental illness in all its various guises. Now, think of the idea that maybe there's a common denominator to mental illness. Maybe it doesn't explain and describe all varieties of of mental illness, but maybe it describes the largest share of mental illness, the most common factor in mental illness. Imagine that might be the case. I've imagined that might be the case, as others have too, and I characterize that factor as one of stuckness. There's a formality to this, but I'm giving you the sort of jargon-free, hopefully more accessible description of it, a stuckness, an opposite of a malleability. malleability would be described as plasticity. If you were to look it up on your phones or whatever right now, you'd probably see plasticity described as the ability to be shaped or molded. So it's malleability, it's changeability. I think the common denominator in mental illness is the inverse of that, the opposite of that, and that's what the stuckness is referring to. It's a resistance to change. It's a stubbornness and a stuckness, a frozenness in one's way of being in the world. So that could manifest as habits of thinking, of feeling, of seeing, perceiving, of behaving. And these habits get entrenched and reinforced, and a sort of vicious cycle, things get more and more stuck. So in a presentation like that, it would make sense that a solution to the problem would be to induce the opposite of that, like a yin and yang principle here, the opposite of that stuckness, and formally that would mean needing to increase plasticity. So that's where to look for a solution, and lo and behold, that's what psychedelics do. They promote plasticity. And you might be thinking, oh, plasticity, that's that neuroscience thing, that's the growth of this and that. No, that's a flavor of plasticity. That might be called anatomical neuroplasticity. Plasticity is much more basic than that. It's really a very fundamental principle of many, many things in the universe, and certainly in nature, and it means changeability. Psychedelics promote changeability. There's a reason why Michael Pollan's book is called How to Change Your Mind, and why that resonated so well with people. There's so much to unpack in all of this, but hopefully I've given you a flavor of some useful principles, a little bit of personal backstory as well. But perhaps as just a final theme, I began with an effort to tell you about the theme of rebirth on Easter Sunday, the day in which, by the mythology, Jesus Christ rose from the dead and was reborn in that sense. And psychedelics, the experiences having that character of rebirth, the very first LSD trip, the next day, Hoffman describes feeling as if he's been reborn. Now, if through the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune one becomes stuck because of whatever adversity and trauma you've suffered within your life, then to have under a psychedelic or some other inducer a big entropic shake-up, then could that recalibrate things in such a way that it would feel like a rebirth? I would submit that that's a valid model, a map, a mechanism, a way to think of the biology and the psychology and the bridging between the two for how psychedelic therapy could be useful for health. So thanks for listening to all of that. I hope some of it made sense, and hopefully we've still got a decent chunk of time for some questions. Thanks, everyone.
Hello. I wanted to ask you about the idea that this Nobel Prize of Physics, Roger Penrose, launched, that consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, or at least part of it happens in the quantum realms. How does it fit your research with psychedelics? What do you think happens when we take psychedelics at the quantum level?
That's a beautiful question. The honest answer from the office would be, I'm not a physicist. I don't know quantum mechanics well enough to do justice to the physics of it. However, that's also an easy get out, isn't it? And so I would say that as an armchair having an armchair interest, at least I'm a scientist, an armchair interest in physics and reading some pop science books. So having some basic knowledge of quantum mechanics, there are themes within quantum mechanics that I can't help but find that resonate with me in terms of thinking of the psychology and the phenomenology. And one that I've used a lot in my book is the particle-wave duality, that things can exist at this subatomic level as in two forms, and both are equally valid. And they only really become one form, particle or wave, when we come in, which is weird, and sample it. And then it breaks down into one of those forms without, to my knowledge, pushing the other form into non-existence. They remain entangled. And I like that. And whether a physicist will read the book or tell me before it's published and I have to rewrite it, that's a false analogy to make, I don't know. But I say mind and brain are like particle-wave duality. Two aspects. They look different in how we look at them. If we look at mind, we look at subjective experience, what it feels like, for example. But if we look at brain, we're doing something quite different and looking at this physico-energetic thing. So there's an essential duality there. However, I would maintain that the two aspects remain entangled, and there is a bridge between them that we can work out and understand. And not everyone would necessarily agree with that bit. I think some people might say mind, soul is independent of brain and body, and I'm yet to be convinced of that. So, yeah, thanks.
Hey, thanks for an awesome talk. That was really interesting. I may be a little heretical here on this celebration of psychedelia and stirring up of the snow globe and asking you about, from the entropic perspective of like shaking up the bar to 11 to break down the stuckness, how do you go and address some of the developments within the chemistry community of people who have developed psychoplastogens, activators of the 5-HT2A receptor that don't induce the head twitch response in mice, that putatively, and if you read some of the trip reports, don't make the walls melt, but do anatomically in mouse models reorient the default mode network. So how do you address that?
Yeah, I would say I'm waiting. It's so good to be heretical in a sense and challenge all models. And on this one, I would say I'm waiting for the trip reports to become data in a sense, as in this whole phenomenon is platformed on rodent research mainly. And so, we take a mouse's apparent sort of twitching of its head as our readout of the psychedelic experience. And whether or not that translation is valid is quite a valid question to ask. And so I'm quite skeptical that it will translate to humans in a way that we'll get really excited about. I think at the moment it's in this interesting preclinical space, which has a lot of gravitas in neuroscience and medicine, perhaps a gravitas that is, I question whether it's necessarily warranted or whether it's something of the system that's been created, like a industrial complex, that generates medicines that may well work well in rodents, but do they really solve our problems in our species? It hasn't been working very well so far in mental health care, that model. So I'm somewhat skeptical. And to me, it would be more of the same of a solution that hasn't been a very good solution. Drugs that you take maybe every day that then run the risk of cumulative side effects. Are they really opening up the psyche in a way that we can acknowledge mind and soul and hear that and work towards a restoration through self-understanding? Or are we trying to drug the problem better? And I just don't think that model has been that impressive for the last half century or so.
So you've done some really interesting work with imaging and serotonergic, signaling with psilocybin. And I did see that you've done some looking into mood disorders and trauma and depression. But we also commonly use serotonergic agents for the other mood disorder and things like OCD. Has there been any ongoing imaging or studies involving other things like OCD and psilocybin?
Yes, not everyone's aware that the very first clinical trial of this renaissance with psychedelics was psilocybin and OCD. And it was Francesco Moreno and colleagues out of San Diego, UC San Diego, so California, representing. And people kind of gloss over that, when we think of the heroes of this renaissance. So he very much and his team deserve a shout there. So that happened, and it wasn't really picked up on and developed. We went to depression, and Hopkins and NYU go to end-of-life anxiety, and Bogenschutz and Matt Johnson, addiction, the trial started with OCD, and it is going full circle. My colleagues at Imperial have done a trial with psilocybin for OCD, quite promising results, and I'll be missing stuff as well. There's so much these days. So it's coming back, and it's very much fits the stuckness model. The jargon term that I didn't share, but I'll share now, is canalization. So the formal opposite of plasticity is something called canalization. And the analogy for that is it's the clues in the name. It's a canal. It's a canal. And it goes back to, I think it goes back originally to Henri Bergson, the guy of the élan vital, the life force, and he said life isn't like a canal, it's more like a naturally meandering river. A canal is a man-made, contrived thing that routes things in one direction, so there's limited freedom. So that's the metaphor, and others picked up on it. But in this context, it's referring to both the process and the outcome of this stuckness, and this being the thing that goes awry in the development of mental illness. Not all of it, because some of it could be characterized more as a hyperplastic state, like a delirium or an acute psychotic episode, but most of it. And that's what models are for. Models are for describing a certain amount of territory, but they're not the territory itself, and we should always remember that. Yeah, sure.
Hi. With any luck, I'll get to see you speak again and ask further questions. But in the short run, if I could bring up two things real quick. If you're able to talk more about Groff, and I got a chance to do the Groff breath work just one time about 30 years ago. I have post-concussion syndrome, and I'm a patient actually at UCSF Neurology, and my neurological optometrist, of all people at UC Berkeley, told me to take mushrooms to treat my traumatic brain injury, and I can't find any research about it, and I'm very curious what you might say.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Well, it's happening. It's mostly happening with psilocybin as a hypothesis to test that's being tested. There is some work on traumatic brain injury and psychedelics in the context of ibogaine. So Nolan Williams at Stanford and his colleagues have now published on some observational research. So they didn't give the ibogaine, but they observed work being done in a clinic in Mexico, I believe, with people with traumatic brain injury and all the sequelae that comes with that, so depression and poor cognition and often PTSD symptoms if it's combat trauma, for example, or others. And the results are pretty interesting. They published on the clinical results, and I think there's some brain imaging work to come as well. But I like that you bring it up as well, because it gives me an opportunity to bring up rebirth again and regeneration and restoration, because that would be the model. It's that there's been this injury, physical injury and psychological injury, but through some shake-up of some sort, the system can now recalibrate and be a process of recovery, of regeneration that's intrinsic. So this is very Groffian. That's intrinsic is allowed or facilitated along. It's catalyzed along. Natural processes of healing are catalyzed along, and so the holotropic in Groff's model is towards wholeness. So the suggestion is that, at least in my mind, I think in his writings, that the injury is characterized as some distance from wholeness. There's been a splitting, in a sense, a segregation, if you want. And so the healing action, intrinsic healing action, is towards a more integrated system. So, we could go into some of the weeds in terms of the low-level neurobiology of this, in terms of growth of synaptic branches that may regenerate after psychedelic experiences, that may atrophy with stress or physical injury or both. That atrophy may be being part of the canalization picture, atrophy through stress, but also habit formation through reinforcement, specific reinforcement. So two forces working together to kind of create a stuckness. But the model with the regeneration is to shake things in such a way that there can be a recovery of freedom, in a sense. So if new synaptic branches are coming back when they were atrophied with stress or reinforced in a specific way, so certain branches kept being reinforced because of taking methamphetamine or drinking alcohol or whatever, then that specification that formed is the problem, and then the shake-up can allow a kind of return to some balance, some like homeostatic correction. And so, yeah, that's the kind of model that I'm playing with at the moment, and others are sort of coming to the same thing through different measures and terminology. Yeah. Time? Okay, well, thanks everyone. I enjoyed that. Hope it was all right.